Welcome, weary travelers of the mind, to Sleepless Historian Uncovered. Settle in, dim the lights, and let the noise of the day fade into a soft, distant hum. Here we do not wrestle with the present, but drift gently into the quiet currents of the past, uncovering the forgotten stories that shaped our world, one soothing word at a time. Tonight, our journey takes us to the heart of the Roman Empire, to the glittering, treacherous, and often terrifying world of the Emperor Nero. We will not speak of the grand battles or the political machinations that defined his reign, but of a story far more intimate, more personal, and perhaps more disturbing. It is a story of absolute power, of profound, twisted grief, and of a young life irrevocably shattered to satisfy an emperor's delusion. It is the story of a boy named Sporus, a name that echoes through history not for what he did, but for what was done to him. He was a beautiful young man who had the misfortune of bearing a striking resemblance to Nero's dead wife, the Empress Poppaea Sabina, a woman the emperor had loved with a dangerous obsessive passion, and whose death, perhaps at his own hand, had left him utterly devastated. In the depths of his mourning, Nero's grief curdled into a monstrous fantasy. He would not simply replace his lost love, he would recreate her. This is the story of how a Roman emperor used his absolute power to erase a human being, to castrate a boy and force him into the role of his empress, creating a living doll to soothe his own broken mind. Now, close your eyes and let us journey back to the Rome of Nero, to the beginning of one of history's most tragic and bizarre tales. In the sprawling labyrinthine corridors of the Palatine Hill, where the fate of the known world was decided amidst the whisper of silk and the glint of marble, there lived a young man named Sporus. He was a freedman, one of the countless individuals who existed in the complex grey space between slavery and true freedom, his life and livelihood utterly dependent on the shifting whims of the imperial household. Ancient sources tell us little of his origins, of the family he was born to or the life he led before his name became forever entwined with that of the emperor. What they do tell us is that he possessed a beauty that was both striking and dangerous. It was a delicate, almost feminine beauty, with fine features and a grace that set him apart in a court filled with the ambitious and the powerful. It was a beauty that, in a world ruled by a man like Nero, was not a gift, but a terrible, inescapable curse. The Rome that Sporus knew was a city of dazzling contradictions. It was the magnificent heart of a global empire, a city of grand temples, of colossal amphitheatres, of public baths that were marvels of engineering. But beneath this veneer of imperial grandeur, it was a place of raw, untamed appetites, a city where unimaginable wealth lived side by side with desperate poverty, and where the rule of law was often subject to the caprices of the man who sat upon the throne, and the man on that throne was Nero. By this time in his reign, the emperor had been in power for many years, and the promising young ruler, the student of the great philosopher Seneca, had long since vanished, replaced by a man of terrifying and unpredictable passions. He saw himself not as a statesman, but as an artist, a divine performer on the world's great stage. His reign was a spectacle, a grand, chaotic opera of his own devising, and he was its star. He wrote poetry, he performed on the lyre, he raced chariots in the Circus Maximus, and he dealt with any obstacle to his desires, be it his mother, his wife, or a Roman senator, with a swift and brutal finality. His was a world of absolute power, and in such a world, the lines between reality and fantasy, between love and possession, had begun to blur with fatal consequences. The catalyst for the tragedy of Sporus was the death of a woman, Poppaea Sabina, Nero's second wife, and by all accounts the great obsessive love of his life. She was a woman of legendary beauty and sharp political instincts, and Nero had moved heaven and earth to make her his empress, divorcing and later executing his first wife Claudia Octavia to clear the path for her. Theirs was a relationship of intense, fiery passion, but in the court of Nero, such passion often burned too close to violence. A couple of years prior, Poppaea, then pregnant with another child, was dead. The official cause was a complication of childbirth, a tragically common fate for women in the ancient world. But a darker rumour, one whispered in the shadowed corners of the Senate, and recorded with grim satisfaction by later historians, told a different story. It was a story of a domestic argument, of a late return from the chariot races, of a single violent and petulant kick from the emperor to his pregnant wife's abdomen. We will never know the truth of that night. What we do know is that Poppaea's death shattered Nero's world. His grief was not the quiet, dignified mourning of a Roman statesman. It was a theatrical, all-consuming despair, another grand performance for the world to witness. He refused to have her body cremated, as was the Roman custom. Instead, he had her embalmed in the Egyptian manner, her body stuffed with spices, a permanent, beautiful effigy of the woman he had lost. He delivered a soaring eulogy at her state funeral, praising her beauty and her virtues, and had the Senate declare her a goddess, a temple to be built in her honor. An unimaginable quantity of the entire empire's incense supply was burned at her funeral, a fragrant cloud of imperial grief that hung over the city for days. But these grand public gestures could not fill the void in his own broken and increasingly unstable mind. He was an emperor, a god in the eyes of many, but he was powerless against the finality of death. He could not bring Poppaea back, and so, in the depths of his grief, a new, more monstrous obsession began to take hold. If he could not resurrect her, he would recreate her. It was in this state of mind that his eyes fell upon Sporus. Whether it was a chance encounter in a palace hallway, or a deliberate search orchestrated by courtiers desperate to appease their grieving master, the ancient sources agree on one chilling fact. The young freedman bore an uncanny resemblance to the dead Empress. Cassius Dio, a historian writing generations later but with access to the imperial archives, noted that the similarity was striking. Perhaps it was the shape of the eyes, the line of the jaw, the delicate bone structure. Whatever it was, for Nero, it was enough. In the face of Sporus, the emperor saw a ghost, a flicker of the woman he had lost, and he became fixated. The plan that formed in Nero's mind was a testament to the absolute corruption of absolute power. It was a plan that would violate every law, every custom, and every tenet of Roman morality. He, the emperor, would transform this boy into his new empress. The first step was swift, brutal, and irreversible. Nero commanded his imperial physicians to castrate Sporus. In ancient Rome, castration was not unknown, but it was a practice associated with the slaves and priests of Eastern mystery cults. To perform the act on a Roman, even a freedman, was technically illegal, a violation of the deep-seated Roman belief in the sanctity of the citizen's body. But the laws of Rome were for other men. Nero was the law. The procedure itself, in an age before modern anesthesia or antiseptic, would have been an excruciating and life-threatening ordeal. We can only imagine the terror of the young man held down by imperial guards in a cold marble room as the physicians approached with their scalpels and their cauterizing irons. His screams would have been lost in the vast, indifferent luxury of the palace. It was not just a physical mutilation, it was the first and most violent act in the complete and systematic erasure of his identity. He had been Sporus, a man. He was now being remade into something else, a vessel for an emperor's delusion. Once the physical transformation was complete, the psychological reconditioning began. Sporus, now a eunuch, was removed from the world of men and placed in the care of the women of the court. He was given a new name, Sabina, the name of the dead empress. He was taught a new way to live, a new way to be. Tutors were assigned to instruct him in the arts of feminine deportment. He learned how to walk not with the stride of a man, but with the graceful gliding steps of a Roman matron. He learned how to sit, how to arrange the folds of his new garments, the stola and veils of an empress, in a way that was modest and pleasing to the eye. He learned how to speak, his voice coached to a higher, softer pitch, his language trained to adopt the specific mannerisms and turns of phrase expected of a woman of high rank. His very appearance was reshaped day by day into a more perfect echo of Poppaea. His hair was dressed in the elaborate styles favoured by the late empress. His face was painted with the cosmetics of the imperial court, kohl to darken the eyes, chalk to whiten the skin, rouge for the cheeks, and he was adorned with Poppaea's own jewels, the pearls and emeralds that had once graced the woman he was now forced to impersonate. Each morning he would look into a polished bronze mirror and see not his own reflection but the face of a ghost, a beautifully crafted illusion staring back at him. And then came the final, most public and most blasphemous act of this grotesque transformation. While on a grand tour of Greece, Nero announced that he would marry Sporus. This was not to be a private ceremony, it was a full, formal and public wedding, with all the rites and rituals that would accompany the marriage of an emperor. A dowry was paid. A bridal veil, the traditional flame-coloured flammeum, was placed upon Sporus's head. Tigellinus, Nero's notoriously ruthless praetorian prefect, played the role of the bride's father, giving the bride away. The Greeks, eager to curry favour with their powerful Roman master, held great public celebrations, offering the traditional prayers and sacrifices for the union, even, as Cassius Dio notes with a tone of utter disbelief, praying that the couple might be blessed with legitimate children. It was a spectacle of madness, a piece of theatre so bizarre and so contrary to Roman values that it scandalized even the most jaded observers. Roman society, while tolerant of a wide range of sexual behaviors for the elite male, was built upon a rigid understanding of gender roles and the sanctity of the marriage rite. For an emperor to publicly marry a man, a castrated boy no less, was not just an act of personal depravity, it was an attack on the very foundations of Roman society. It was an announcement that the emperor was no longer bound by any law, any tradition or any reality, but his own. For Sporus, this new life as the Empress Sabina was a gilded cage, a waking nightmare of constant performance. He accompanied Nero everywhere, from the athletic games of Greece to the imperial court in Rome. He was paraded in a litter, dressed in the finest regalia, the object of a million curious, horrified and pitying stares. He had to respond to a dead woman's name, to feign recognition of people from Poppaea's past, to participate in conversations about shared memories of a life he had never lived. Every moment was a test, every interaction a tightrope walk over a chasm of potential imperial rage. A single misstep, a flicker of his old self, a failure to perfectly inhabit the role of the ghost he was meant to be, could have meant a swift and terrible death. The ancient sources, written by men who were hostile to Nero and his excesses, offer us no insight into Sporus's own thoughts or feelings. He is a silent figure in their narratives, a beautiful tragic prop in the drama of an emperor's madness. Did he feel a flicker of pride in his new elevated status? Did he find moments of quiet survival in the luxury that surrounded him? Or was his every waking moment a silent scream, a desperate internal struggle to hold on to some small secret kernel of the self that had been so brutally taken from him? We can only imagine the profound psychological toll, the daily, hourly effort of erasing oneself in order to survive. This bizarre and tragic chapter of Sporus's life continued for the remainder of Nero's reign, but the emperor's grand, chaotic performance was nearing its final act. His excesses, his cruelty, and his increasingly erratic behavior had alienated the Senate, the army, and the Roman elite. The empire, which he had treated as his personal stage, was beginning to turn on him. The following spring, the first of the great rebellions broke out in the provinces. The legions of Gaul and Spain, led by their governors, renounced their allegiance to Nero and began to march on Rome. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own elite bodyguards, were bribed to desert him. The Senate, sensing the shift in the political winds, finally found the courage to act. They declared Nero an enemy of the state, a hostis, sentencing him to be beaten to death in public. The emperor's world collapsed with a breathtaking speed. The man who had been the master of the world was now a hunted fugitive. He fled Rome in the middle of the night, accompanied by only a handful of his most loyal freedmen, and among that small, desperate group, dressed still in the fine, soft garments of an empress, was Sporus. Even at the end, even with the world crashing down around him, Nero could not let go of his beautiful, tragic creation. They took refuge in a small, shabby villa outside the city, the property of his freedman Fan. Here, in these last desperate hours, the full pathos of Nero's delusion was laid bare. He paced the floor, alternating between quoting Greek poetry, lamenting the loss of so great an artist as himself, and making clumsy, half-hearted attempts to prepare for his own suicide. He begged his companions to kill him, but none would strike the blow. He ordered a grave to be dug, all the while weeping and repeating the phrase, "What an artist dies in me." He turned to Sporus, his Sabina, and in a final, pathetic act, he begged the boy to begin the formal lamentations, to weep for him as a wife would for her dying husband. But the sound of approaching horsemen, the soldiers sent to capture him, finally spurred him to action. With the help of his scribe Epaphroditus, Nero placed a dagger to his throat, and with a final, trembling effort, ended his own life, his blood soaking into the dirt floor of that humble, borrowed room. For Sporus, the death of the emperor was not a liberation, it was merely the end of one chapter of his nightmare and the beginning of another. He was now a living symbol of the most hated and reviled aspects of the dead emperor's reign. He was a piece of property, a spoil of war, and his fate was now in the hands of the ambitious and ruthless men who were scrambling to fill the power vacuum left by Nero's fall. Before Nero's body was even cold, Sporus was taken into the possession of Nymphidius Sabinus, the Praetorian prefect who had betrayed Nero and who now harbored his own ambitions of becoming emperor. Sabinus, in a twisted attempt to bolster his own legitimacy, continued the grotesque fiction. He took Sporus as his own wife, called him Poppaea, and treated him as a symbol of his inheritance of Nero's power. But Sabinus's own bid for the throne was short-lived. He was killed by his own guardsmen, who were not yet ready to accept a new emperor who had not come from the established elite, and so Sporus was passed on again. He fell into the hands of Otho, one of the succession of emperors who would rule in the chaotic and bloody year that followed. And here the story takes on another layer of bizarre, tragic irony. Otho had been the first husband of the real Poppaea Sabina, the man Nero had forced her to divorce so many years before. Now, in a strange and perverse twist of fate, Otho found himself in possession of his former wife's living effigy. The ancient sources tell us that Otho too had intimacy with Sporus, continuing the cycle of abuse and humiliation. But Otho's reign was also fleeting. He ruled for only a brief period before he too committed suicide after a decisive military defeat. And Sporus was passed on again, this time to the new emperor, the gluttonous and cruel Vitellius. And it was under Vitellius that Sporus's long and terrible ordeal would finally reach its horrific climax. Vitellius, unlike his predecessors, had no personal connection to Nero's past, and thus no use for Sporus as a living symbol of a dead empress. He saw in the young man not a trophy but an opportunity for a new and even more depraved form of public entertainment. He decided to use Sporus in the gladiatorial games at the Colosseum. But Sporus was not to be a gladiator, he was to be a victim. Vitellius planned a grand public spectacle, a theatrical reenactment of a famous Roman myth, the rape of Proserpina, the story of the young goddess who is abducted by Pluto and forced to become the queen of the underworld. And in this cruel public parody, the role of the ravished maiden Proserpina was to be played by Sporus. It was the final unthinkable humiliation. After years of being forced to live as a woman in the private chambers of emperors, he was now to be publicly sexually violated on the sands of the Colosseum, for the amusement of a jeering Roman mob. It was a fate worse than death. It was the complete and final annihilation of any last lingering shred of his own humanity. And in that moment, faced with this ultimate degradation, Sporus, the boy who had been a slave, a freedman, a eunuch, an empress, and a political pawn, made the first and last truly free choice of his adult life. He would not allow it. He would not be the star of Vitellius's cruel theatre. He found a way to take his own life. The ancient sources do not tell us how, perhaps with a hidden dagger, perhaps with poison. They only tell us that he died in the tumultuous year that followed Nero's fall, before he could be dragged onto the stage. He was barely a man grown, scarcely out of his teens. In death, Sporus finally escaped the role that had been forced upon him. He reclaimed his own story, ending it on his own terms. His life is a dark and disturbing footnote in the grand narrative of the Roman Empire, a story that is often overlooked in the great sweep of emperors and legions. But it is a story that deserves to be remembered. It is a haunting testament to the absolute depths of human cruelty, and to the terrifying ways in which absolute power can warp reality itself. And it is, in its own tragic way, a story of the enduring power of the human spirit, of a young man who, when faced with a final, unendurable humiliation, found in death the one freedom that life had so relentlessly denied him. His name, which may have been a cruel nickname meaning seed, became in the end a symbol not of what he was, but of all that had been stolen from him, a quiet, eternal testament to a life that was never allowed to be lived.